Hello and welcome to Into the Abyss podcast. My name's Todd Decker, and I'm here with Rick, and we're going to do another Star Trek episode. Welcome back, Rick.
Pleasure to be here, as always.
All right, so today we're talking about the different leadership styles and of different captains and fill-in captains and all the people who've taken different leadership roles in Star Trek and kind of left it very broad and open like that, and we'll see where this goes. So we, of course, have our series captains, but then we were just talking before how there are some others who have some interesting examples of maybe good or bad leadership styles, depending on how you look at it or what your personality is like. So, so how should we get started, Rick? Do you want to start with the series captains and kind of work our way through?
Yeah, that probably sounds good.
Okay. All right. Well, course, well, we could go chronologically, or we could go by the series as they were produced. So, I mean, I was thinking Kirk. So do you want to, shall we start with him?
We might as well start with Kirk, because that's probably where most everyone would want to begin anyway. So, yes.
All right. So Kirk, very, very unique in a way. I mean, when I think of Kirk, he's like, I can't think of another Star Trek captain, or at least of the main captains of the leads, who's quite like him. How would you describe Kirk's leadership style?
Cowboy style is kind of how I would describe it, because the 23rd century of Star Trek was very different from the 24th century, and I would say that the more recent series have focused on the 24th century. And so even though Captain Picard, Captain Sisko, and Captain Janeway, who are all from the 24th century era, all have very unique and different styles, but they do have certain limits. And in the 24th century, Starfleet and the Federation is much more fleshed out in terms of like codes of behavior and certain standards. And Kirk definitely was more on the rebellious side, but in Kirk's era, the Federation was not as far-flung as it was 100 years from then. It had only been around for about a century, so in the cosmic sense, it's still very young. 200 years is pretty young as well, but I would say that, yeah, space is still kind of an unexplored frontier. By the 24th century, they have a very good idea of where they are in the galaxy, the Alpha Quadrant, the Beta Quadrant. Even though they haven't explored everything, they have heard of a lot of different species and civilizations, and there's a lot more information, whereas in Kirk's time, a lot of our neighborhood is still unexplored. And so I would say that Kirk definitely marches to the beat of his own tambourine. Probably, I mean, they all use their own sense of judgment, but Kirk is just a bit more cavalier when it comes to carrying things out. He's very good with his crew. They, of course, are, respect him. They love him. But yeah, he sometimes he doesn't shy away from stepping out of bounds, or as the original series movies go, disobeying orders from time to time.
Yeah, and Spock, I would say, seems to be more the one who pretty much follows the rules, or is a little bit more predictable than Kirk. Although I guess I'm thinking of the films, which I'm most familiar with. He does break rules as well, but maybe a little bit more calculated about it.
Sure. Well, he is a Vulcan, so
right.
So I will say Spock is definitely, obviously, the level-headed one of the two of them. Certainly the more reasonable, logical. rational, less emotional of the two of them. Um, 23rd century, but even that kind of brashness of the era kind of carried forth, because in the Next Generation, there's an episode called Unification. It's a two-parter, and it's where Spock disappears. And at this point, he's an ambassador, so he's still alive because Vulcans live for about 200 years. So he's alive in Picard's time. And he disappears to go to Romulus as part of a peace mission, but he doesn't tell anybody where he's going, and he certainly doesn't tell Starfleet or the Federation what he's doing. And of course, when they find out, they're very alarmed because they're questioning, like, was this a possible defection, which it was not. But when Picard finally catches up with Spock, Spock says, I wanted to pursue this matter without putting anyone else at risk. And Picard said, well, this has direct repercussions for the Federation. You discuss it with the Federation. And Spock says, well, that was precisely what I was hoping to avoid. And Picard says, this sort of cowboy diplomacy will not be tolerated any further. So that's kind of where I got the idea of also Kirk being a cowboy, because even Spock, for as logical and as well thought out as he still, I think, is a product of his time. And so probably has more in common with Kirk than we would expect. It wouldn't seem that way, like when you put him next to Kirk, but when you put him next to Picard, the differences are stark. So
that's a very good point. Now, I know they have a little bit of the structure of Starfleet that they show in the films. I don't remember in the original series. Do they? Because in Next Generation, Picard's always on his comm with some ambassador or not ambassador, or some admiral, right? Somebody in the ranks that he has to report to. Do they show that type of structure with Kirk in the original series?
There are admirals in the original series. I haven't seen all the episodes. That's the only series that I haven't seen pretty much everything. But yeah, there are definitely admirals with the same frequency. I think also 100 years difference in terms of technology. So it may also have taken more time for admirals to get messages to start, whereas by the 24th century, essentially talk in real time, or maybe with like a few hours of difference. It might not have been the case in the 23rd century. It certainly wasn't the case in the 22nd century with Captain Archer. So maybe that's the reason. But yeah, there were definitely admirals and people who issued orders.
Yeah, well, and I think I'd like to compare and contrast him a little bit. A few members of the Enterprise crew with the Next Generation crew, which I guess is also Enterprise, but so Kirk, he's also one who's kind of the womanizer, sort of like Riker as well, right? He's got a little bit of that behavior going on.
Yes. So Riker, I think, is a bit more respectful. He's, more like the 24th century ladies' man. So whereas Kirk is very much like, well, I think so here's the issue is that, yes, Star Trek is set in the 22nd, 23rd, 24th centuries and beyond. And it's this idealistic view of humanity, but we still have to remember that it's also being portrayed by actors from the 20th and 21st centuries. And so Gene Roddenberry, while he had a very positive and I would say progressive view of the future, he himself was still very much a man of his time. So 1960s television. And so Kirk, as well as the original Captain Pike from the original pilot, The Cage. So that was actor Jeffrey Hunter, and not the ones that have come later. Very, not saying that this doesn't apply to these Captain Pikes, but like they were your handsome leading Hollywood men types, white, very conventionally good looking, and even though we have this progressive view of, they still are popular with the ladies. And of course, in terms of entertainment in the 1960s, there is of course going to be this more traditional idea of masculinity, and I would say leadership, and well, also sex appeal. So
Right.
From what I've read, that some of these ideas were actually Roddenberry's. Roddenberry kind of still had this old-fashioned idea about television stars, and so I think that's where that comes from for both Kirk as well as Riker, because he also got the Next Generation started and then passed away, a few years later.
Right. So yes, and I agree. So like Riker is very interesting. So like obviously single guy, very interested in the ladies, but also pretty much follows the rules for the most part. I mean, he's very strict, even with Captain Picard. He knows protocol. He knows that he will follow Captain Picard's orders, except in regards to the captain's safety, right? So I think it's even in the pilot episode where he says, I'll follow all orders except in the case where your life is at stake. In that case, I'm going to contravene your directives. And Picard says, you're going to back down from that? No, he's not. So yeah, in a way, he's also very professional, which is kind of funny. But I could also see, like, in the Star Trek world, we're looking at this kind of outlook where maybe easier in the 60s, between the 60s and the 90s, to have a little bit idealized vision of what sexuality could look like in the future, of being less inhibited and without problems, right? Whereas I think in the 2020s, we're looking at that, and it's a little bit more problematic, where we look at Riker and think, okay, well, should a supervisor on a starship be having relations with the people subordinate to him on the Enterprise, right? That seems a little bit more problematic. Where probably when it was made in the late 80s and early 90s, as long as he was not doing anything obviously aggressive, it probably seemed okay. Or I guess what my point being that this kind of futuristic idea that I think is kind of part of the Star Trek ideology of a liberated sexuality in the future is kind of what was envisioned there. I don't know. Does that seem right to you?
Yes and no. I mean, like, they are more liberated, or they well, and that also kind of depends, like, from person to person. The thing is, I think it's interesting that you're kind of focusing on Riker here, but obviously, like, he's the younger, handsome first officer, and he himself, is not the captain. And even though he is the first officer, that's not where the buck stops. And
right.
So, as far as regulations go, because it's been said, as far as relations between crew members, there is no regulation against it. And I think it just presumes that, the parties will be adults, that be respectful, and generally speaking, there's no problem, unless of course there's a conflict of interest, like,
right.
They directly report to them, or there's preferential treatment or that sort of thing. There was an episode where Picard briefly dated a lieutenant commander on the Enterprise in the science department.
I wanted to get into that one, because there are a few instances with Picard having a love interest, sort of with not Wesley Crusher, sorry, Beverly Crusher. There we go. With Beverly Crusher. But I don't think that ever really goes too far. But yeah, there's the episode with that one musician where he is kind of in relationship with her. And it explores those issues, right? Because there's kind of some problems.
Right. So Picard's is very much Riker's opposite in this regard, that he does not engage in frivolous love affairs. He's very serious and, doesn't really share his conquests. Uh, when there are conquests, that is, with his crew, because he believes that to be inappropriate. Personally, now there's no specific regulation against that, as I said, but obviously, from Picard's view, there's definitely like a veneer between him and his subordinates, and I think, and I agree and respect that, actually, because I think you do kind of have a greater reverence for Picard for that way, because he is
Absolutely.
um, even though he still is human, but like as an example, and I'll get to the officer you're talking about. Um, those are, the reasons why. Like one reason why he and Beverly Crusher never got together is, well, Picard feels guilty because Jack Crusher was his best friend on the Stargazer, and Jack died under Picard's command. And Picard felt very guilty because I guess he had feelings for Beverly Crusher from before, feelings he never acted on. But it just felt inappropriate, even post-mortem, to pursue that. I was in love with my best friend's wife. And so he kind of tries to rise above that. One of his other love interests, Vash, a woman archaeologist that he met while vacationing on Risa, he never tells anyone in the crew about that pursuit, and so she shows up again about a year later on Enterprise and is really miffed that nobody has heard about her.
Right.
Counselor Troy hasn't, Commander Riker hasn't, and she's like, what's up with that? And then that's a rather amusing episode where Q shows up and then, spirits them away to Sherwood Forest to reenact Robin Hood. But anyway, it's one of those things where, yeah, they all say, well, yes, we know Captain Picard, but they all say the same thing and say, well, he's a very private man. And that's very true. And so then we jump ahead to the 6th season where he is in a relationship with Lieutenant Commander Nella Darren. And she's actually quite a good match for him because she doesn't back down from him. She's respectful, but she still asserts herself. She's highly intelligent. She also does the verbal sparring with him, which I think he enjoys. She's also a musician. She loves to play the piano, and he, of course, plays the Rusican flute from that episode where he was that alien life. But
right,
anyway,
where
that's,
he lived
that's
a
another
full,
episode.
lived a lifetime.
Anyway,
yeah.
But in the episode with Nella, so they get along very well, but it doesn't take long for complications to arise where Darren is in charge of her department and she's asking Riker, for favors, not purposefully, but she's asking for like more time on the sensor array, and she's doing what she feels is the best for her job, but it makes Riker very uncomfortable because at this point he knows that this is the captain's girlfriend, and he's like, well, I need to be objective and possible. And so he goes to Picard and Picard says, just do your job, like you're not going to offend me, but it still becomes awkward for him. And the reason the relationship ultimately ends is because there is an emergency situation on a planet that requires people to be evacuated. And in order to make sure there's enough time to beam them up, Enterprise crew members have to set up a heat shield to avoid a natural disaster, but it's going to be very dangerous. And because she has had direct experience with these heat shields, Darren is put in charge of the mission. And they ultimately are able to save everybody at the installation, but a few Enterprise crew members are lost. And Darren was missing for several hours. And eventually they do beam her up. But Picard was very distraught And he was also very shaken, I think, because he thought that his orders had led to her death. And so he said, I can't guarantee, that I won't have to put your life in danger again, I mean, in all fairness. And so that leads to her having to put in for a transfer. So yes, there can be a definite conflict of interest. And so it's one of those things where it's like, yes, they are adults. Yes, they are free to pursue relationships, but that doesn't mean that there aren't serious complications. And obviously those complications do have to be addressed when it interferes in the operation of the ship.
Right. Yeah, that episode reminds me of another one. And this is actually about Deanna Troi, who's not a captain, but she took a training, I guess, to be authorized to be temporary captain or something like that. You could probably describe it better, but she had to go through training under Commander Riker, and there were these simulations that she would have to do, and basically put simulations of the ship being in peril, and then she would have to act out what would be the proper procedure under those circumstances. And if you pass the test, then you get this promotion. So she keeps on failing the simulation, and it's not for any technical reason, right? She studies the ship and the way it works and all the things that you can do, and there's some type of technical reason the ship is failing, and she can't see any solution how to solve it. But then she finally figures it out. And in the simulation, she tells Geordi LaForge, his simulation anyway, if you go into these vents where you'll be exposed to radiation, will you have enough time to be able to make the repair before you die? And he says, yeah, I would. And she says, okay, do it. And that's the answer. That's the way to pass the test, is that you have to be able to sacrifice a crew member's life in order to save the ship. So that's part of the leadership, right? And so that's the conflict that Captain Picard realizes, that he has to be able to do that, and he realizes he probably won't be able to do that if he's romantically involved with one of the crew members, and that crew member happens to be the one best suited to do that job.
Right. No, exactly. So yeah, Deanna Troi had some interesting leadership episodes herself. What led to her wanting that promotion was an episode in, I want to say, the fifth season, where the Enterprise hit a quantum filament and was essentially deprived of power, and there were no internal ship communications. And Troi ended up being the highest ranking member on the bridge. And so she ended up having to take command of that situation. And in her case, she had never really been put in that situation before. And it was very uncomfortable for her because, you have, Mr. O'Brien, who has been in Starfleet for a very long time, but he's, a non-commissioned officer, and he's making all the technical suggestions, and she has no idea. And she just goes along with most of his technical suggestions. But then she's also having to deal with Ensign Rowe, who is very willful and very aggressive. And at the time, Troi is not. So, but ultimately, Troi makes some very serious decisions on whether or not to and make sure that power gets restored, or possibly to separate the saucer and leave people behind. Ultimately, she ends up making the correct decisions and actually standing up to people. And so that leads her into that seventh season episode that you just mentioned. So before, she was a lieutenant commander, and as a counselor, that's perfectly fine. She doesn't need to be a full-fledged commander, but she decides that she wanted to stretch herself and go for that leadership. And so, yeah, ultimately that was the answer. When she was struggling to find it, though, Riker gives her a hint when he says, I can't let you take the test again because my first duty is to the ship. And then it clicks. She goes back to the holodeck to take the test. And yes, that is the test. It has nothing to do with technical manuals or engineering or anything like that. It's, would you be willing to send an officer to his or her death if it means saving the ship? So yes, that obviously is a very salient point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, we see Picard definitely is somewhat removed from the crew on a personal level. I think that's kind of shown also in the finale, where he never joins the crew for cards, right? Until I believe it's the finale, right? The very last episode. He finally decides that he does, and then he says, "Oh, I should have done this a lot sooner." But for all 7 seasons, that's one thing, right? He doesn't really get too involved socially.
No, there's definitely a lot of detachment there, because in general, at least in the Next Generation, the actors all get along really well, and all of them regularly get together for poker, and you'll always see, not always everybody, but like at least 4 or maybe 5 of them, and it circulates through all of them. You usually see Data. Worf is usually losing. Riker is usually winning and bluffing his way through it. And then Troy and Crusher play off and on, as does Dr. Pulaski during her one season. So yeah, pretty much everyone who has ever, and even Wesley Crusher tries his hand at it. He's not very good. So yeah, everyone except for Picard, up until, like you said, the series finale of the television show. It was the very last scene of the very last episode where he finally joins them and says, "Yes, I should have done this a long time ago."
Right. And I wondered, this is skipping ahead a little bit, but my wife and I are watching Voyager because I guess Netflix is going to stop showing it, unfortunately. But so we've been watching some of those episodes. So we're just in season 1 at the moment. But I've seen a lot of the series. But so Janeway, there's this one episode where she's kind of trying to figure out, okay, what am I doing? What's my role on this? Because we're out in the middle of nowhere. There's 75 years, at maximum warp from everyone else. So it's going to take a long time. And so she's kind of thinking, okay, well, I am a captain, but I'm also kind of the sort of in a parental role for this crew. I need to get to know them because I could be spending the rest of my life with them. And I don't know if this might have been sort of a play off of the card game thing, but there's a holodeck program that Ensign Paris runs, where they're playing pool, and it's like this French cafe, and there's all these strange characters there. But a lot of the other, what's that?
Sandrines.
Yes, there you go. So all these other crew members end up going, and then but during the episode, Tom Paris tells his friend Ensign Kim, right? Oh, can we invite the captain to eat with us? And he says, no, you don't invite the captain to eat with you. She can invite you, but you do not invite her. That's just understood. But then at the end of the episode, Ensign Kim invites her to come and join them on this holodeck program. And she walks in, and they're all kind of not sure how to react. And then she does this funny thing where she like pretends like she doesn't know anything about pool. Is this pool or billiards? And then it turns out she's actually really good at it, and joins them for a game of pool. And that's in season 1. So I didn't know if maybe that was to show, okay, this is going to be a little bit different. And also Janeway, like she has a very close relationship with Chakotay, like even right there in season 1, she's working with him to find her spirit animal, right? Which is a very intimate type of ritual. It's, he's basically helping her in her spiritual life. So there seems to be a little bit of a difference there.
Right. Well, there is. And even, yeah, no, there is. And not just between Chakotay and Janeway, but also Sisko and Kira, because because Sisko is the emissary to the Bajorans, and so and Kira being Bajoran, her is a religious figure in her religion, and so that has caused like some points of contention where like that's originally why he kind of kept her at arm's length, because that aspect of her made him uncomfortable, and then later he comes to terms with that, accepts it, and they become very close personally as well, like Chakotay and Janeway. I imagine in Captain Janeway's situation, though, that is particularly unique because so Voyager lasted for 7 seasons, like Deep Space Nine and The Next Generation. That was stranded in the Delta Quadrant. At first, 70 to 75,000 light years away, which was about a 75-year trip at maximum warp. And so Voyager was a much smaller ship than the Enterprise. It had a crew of roughly 150, whereas the Enterprise D had 1,000. Deep Space Nine had far more than that. So you had about 150 people. And also, there are no star bases. There's nowhere you can go to like transfer crew members or to get additional support. So like the people that were there from day one are, the people that were there at the very end, with the exception of, picking up the Maquis in, the first episode, or picking up those few remaining survivors of the Equinox a few years later. But for the most part, yeah, you're stuck with the same people. And I imagine it was very lonely, which is what they say. And so I think that's what helped her develop a closer rapport with them. Whereas, on the Enterprise D, there's so many people. They're always going from starbase to planet to starbase. They're always getting new crewmates. And so, yeah, I think that situation kind of demanded that. And even though, for better or for worse, I don't know how appropriate this was, Janeway was not just a captain, but a maternal figure, certainly for Ensign Harry Kim, who had just gotten out of the academy. So, yeah, I do think that the relationships that the captains have with the crew vary, and it just depends on their personality and their style, and also just the circumstances. And which, like I said, Voyager, that circumstance was very different from all the others. And so, yeah, I think that did lead her to be a bit closer, but never in a way that was inappropriate, because I think she was always very cognizant of that as well.
Right. Yes. So we skipped over. I skipped over Sisko. So let's go back to Deep Space Nine. So and this is where this is the series I know the least about, unfortunately. But so tell me about Sisko and his style.
Sisko. So he, I would say his arc is very interesting. He starts out as a commander, like that's his rank, but he is in charge of Deep Space Nine. So, there is no captain above him there. And then after the 3rd season, he gets promoted to captain. And so you can kind of in his personality over that, where, the way he starts is very gregarious, not overly so, but, like he has a good sense of humor. He's definitely very tough. And then he becomes more, I don't know how to explain it, but, he definitely grows into the role. He becomes, I would say, wiser and I don't know, almost, yeah, I don't know. Sisko's a very complicated character.
Mm-hmm.
I guess one way to look at it would be in the 1st season episode, Q comes back, and actually Q is traveling with Vash, Captain Picard's former love interest. She shows up in the Gamma Quadrant, and Jadzia Dax and some other crew members find her, and they take her back to Deep Space Nine through the wormhole on one of the runabouts. Anyway, they don't know why she ended up in the Gamma Quadrant. The viewer knows that, if they had watched The Next Generation, that it was because of Q. And so Q shows up again, trying to get Vash to, partner up with him again, even though she's done with him. And when Sisko finally meets Q, Q is trying to provoke Sisko kind of like he would Picard. And Picard normally is very, dismissive, and Q, just go away. We're not going to play with you. And then Q kind of, snaps his fingers, and suddenly he's in a boxing match with Sisko, and he's like fisticuffs, and he's like making fists or what. And Sisko finally just gets tired of it. He just kind of shrugs, and then he just punches Q in the face, and Q goes falling to the floor. And Q says, he's like, "You hit me. Picard never hit me." And Sisko looks down at him and he says, "I'm not Picard." And so,
that's funny.
And so, yeah. And Q says, "Indeed not. You're much easier to provoke. So much the better for me," before he disappears. But I feel like that scene is very evocative of like the differences between Picard and Sisko. And Picard is, if you look at the different interests of the captain, so Picard loves archaeology, but he's also a diplomat, and he is a very skilled diplomat. And that being said, he can kind of rise above the fray or detach himself from situations. And Sisko does not. Sisko is very direct, not just with Q, but in his dealings with most people. And he doesn't have a problem, saying things just as they are. So, and forgive me for saying the word, but yeah, Sisko was not going to put up with Q's shit. So
yeah, right.
So he punched him in the face.
Yeah, that's interesting too. That do you think we see more of a transformation in his leadership roles throughout the series? I mean, so he didn't start out off as a captain, right? So that's one thing that's kind of different.
Yes. So I think that he does become a bit more judicious over time. I think he was, I don't want to say a more traditional Starfleet officer, but he had more traditional Starfleet views as far as spirituality were concerned. And he came to sort of embrace that with the Bajoran people before he kind of, like I said, kept that at arm's length, and then over time came to accept his role. And I think he went from having a more black and white understanding of the universe to seeing the nuances in the universe. And so I think that, yes, there was that arc of growth. But Sisko, though, where I don't think he ever changed, is that he is such a pillar of strength. And there was an episode, I think towards the end of the second season, where Chief O'Brien is abducted by the Cardassians and is going to be put on trial as part of their teams. And the chief Archon, Makbar, she's essentially the judge, hails Deep Space Nine to inform Sisko of the trial. And so she says, her name is Makbar, and that, Chief O'Brien is being held as an enemy of the Cardassian people. And Sisko says, "Can I speak to him?" And she says, "That's not possible. Can I be assured that he's being treated well?" She's like, "Mr. O'Brien is being treated with the greatest of care." And he says, "Really? Because if he's not, I will hold you personally responsible. And if that sounds like a threat, it is." Mm-hmm. And then Makbar says, "Gul Dukat has told me all about you. You live up to your reputation, Commander." And Sisko says, "That's right, I do."
Nice.
So he doesn't mince words at all. And that doesn't change from that season or any other. He's always definitely he's in charge. He says things the way they are. He doesn't have any patience for prevarication, which neither does Picard really, but Picard will put up with it. Sisko will not.
Right. Yeah, and I guess if you're the hostage, if you're Chief O'Brien in that situation, you like that your captors know that your captain is a force to be reckoned with.
Right. No, that's definitely very true. And actually, I think that's something that's very different. Picard is definitely very concerned about the well-being of his crew, but Picard also understands the mission of Starfleet and the Federation and, the integrity of the Prime Directive and those sorts of things. And there are times where Picard has to make that hard choice where, in a sense, he's sacrificing someone. And Janeway and Sisko values, but you'll notice that they never leave anybody behind, ever.
Mm-hmm.
And, or if they do, it's temporarily. They're coming back for them.
Right.
So sometimes at very great risk. So that is something that Janeway and Sisko do that Picard usually doesn't.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Good. Okay. So we talked about Janeway. Do we want to say any more about Janeway for the moment?
I feel like there's a lot we could say about, Sisko and Janeway. And what I will say about her is that, so she was the first woman captain of a series. We saw female captains in like minor supporting roles, but she's the first one we see as the lead of a series. And I feel like she is judged very harshly in some Star Trek fan circles for decisions that she made. And I do feel that that even though, we are making progress in our own society, that Janeway sometimes has been judged unnecessarily or very harshly. And I feel that the reason why she made certain decisions was, again, because of her unique situation of being stranded in the Delta Quadrant, one starship, without support, without the rest of Starfleet. And I think that led to a lot of those decisions, and not because she's a woman, but you know that is kind of probably what some people are thinking.
So what kind of decisions are have been criticized?
Well, there is the episode of Tuvix, which that could be like a discussion entirely on its own. And Porter accident and deciding, essentially like who lives and who doesn't. The fact that she got them stranded there in the first place, her decision not to use the caretaker's array to get them home, decisions with the Borg, like when she made the alliance with the Borg and Scorpion. The thing is that she made some really, I think, bold decisions, again, because of the circumstances. This is the situation you have been forced into. And once they come to Borg space, I mean, their space is vast. There's no going around it. So she sees an opportunity present itself, and she makes an alliance with the Borg because they have something, that they need in order to defeat species 8472. And so I don't have anything specific to say, but I just feel that she gets criticized probably the most of those 24th century captains, and I just don't feel like that's warranted. So
sure. Well, and you also have to have a series. So, like, for example, if she hadn't destroyed the array, then you don't really have much of a premise for the whole series to begin with, right?
Right. And again, and her reasons for doing so were definitely very Starfleet. I mean,
right.
We're definitely very idealistic. We're saving a species, and from annihilation from another. And Tuvok said that, that the Prime Directive would seem to apply. And she says, we didn't ask to be involved, but we are,
right.
Whether you like it or not. And really, that is the truth. I mean, they didn't ask to be involved, but they are in that situation, and there is a decision to make. And that really is leadership, hard choices.
Right.
So that was one of them right there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, she's I'm really enjoying watching Voyager, and she's a big part of it. I really enjoy her character. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
and Scorpion was the other one. I have seen that episode. That one's a little later on, but yeah, and very risky. But I mean, I guess that's one of the things is in leadership. There's kind of decisions that where you have to take risks sometimes to make gains. But it can be very scary, right? So, like, it reminds me of, just to use a contemporary example, of the operation to get Bin Laden in Pakistan, right? Where there's limited information, and it could be a big gain or it could be disastrous, and eventually somebody just has to make the decision, right? And I'm sure there are many cases like that where a president has to do something like that. But and then in that particular circumstance, so basically they had to make an alliance with the Borg, which the Borg eventually did renege on. But how would you say that worked out for them? I mean, I could think that kind of still served them in the end, right? I mean, because they got some intel, they got a Borg crew member, right?
Sure. Well, when you think about it, it's now granted, when Picard encountered the Borg, Starfleet had no prior experience with them, or I should say, they were not aware of any prior experience, even though there is an episode of Enterprise where they did encounter a few drones in a ship. And of course, Seven of Nine's parents were aware of the Borg before that, but again, that was not widespread knowledge. So you have the Enterprise, which is the flagship of the fleet, and its first encounter with the Borg did not go well. And the only reason that the Enterprise D survived is because Picard swallowed his pride, told Q that he needed him, and Q snapped his fingers, and the Enterprise, was flung, back to Federation space, from where it had started. And now Janeway and Voyager have the advantage of at least some prior knowledge of the Borg, so that is helpful to them. And Voyager is more technologically advanced, at least in terms of its, a newer design than the Enterprise D, but it still does not have the same size or the same arsenal that the Enterprise D does. And yet they are very successful in their dealings with the Borg, not just that time, but, in many successive occasions. And so I would say that her thinking was definitely very unique. Do they risk trying to go through Borg territory on their own, which would be suicide? Do they find a planet in the Delta Quadrant and settle down, or, go another direction? But there's really no going around it. If you go in another direction, you go from a 75-year voyage to who knows, So I think she has to be applauded for her courage and her unique thinking, because she's in the Leonardo da Vinci holodeck program when she's debating what to do. And she says to Leonardo, I have to go forward. If I try to cross between these two enemies that are trying to destroy each other, I will be destroyed as well. But if I turn around, then I lose any chance of ever getting home. And the Leonardo da Vinci hologram, who's played by John Rhys Davies in a wonderful performance, says, Katerina, because, she's Catherine, I find that when one's imagination cannot provide an answer, we must seek out a greater imagination, And so then he takes her by the hand. He's like, come, we will go to the chapel. We will sit in prayer and we will appeal to God. And Janeway, the commensurate scientist, kind of smirks and shakes her hand. She says, I don't think that's going to help.
Hmm.
in this case. She gets up and she says, but there is something that I hadn't considered before. What if I made an appeal to the devil? And in this case, she doesn't mean the devil, she means the Borg.
The Borg,
And
yeah.
so she had been propelled to a decision that she normally wouldn't make, but she thought, okay, I have access to information about species 8472 that they can't assimilate. And this technology may make a difference to them. We've got them over a barrel. Maybe if we can see it through, they'll make a deal with us. And again, ultimately that is successful up until the very end, where once they do defeat species 8472 in the sense that they withdraw from the conflict, then 7 of 9 says that the alliance is terminated. But at that point, she's a single drone on the ship and they're able to get away. So yeah, they got everything that they more.
Right. Well, and they ultimately are able to get through Borg space.
Exactly.
Which,
now, granted, some of that. That was also kind of with the help of Kes, because as 7 of 9 is coming onto the series, that's when Kes is departing, and Kes becomes, she evolves into a non-corporeal being of great power, and in that moment, she at least has the ability to propel Voyager about 10,000 light years away, so safely beyond Borg space.
Ah, okay, I'd forgotten that. All right.
Yeah.
But they do have multiple interactions with them after that as well.
Well, the Borg are all over the Delta Quadrant, and they also show up in different parts of the galaxy because of their transwarp network. So yeah, they still run into them. They're just not like at the center of their space.
Right. Okay. Cool. Good. So let's see. We've gone through what I would call the big four, but do we want to touch on some of the others? So we got Archer, right, and then some of the other series I'm not as familiar with. But do you want to talk about any of those other captains?
Sure. So Captain Archer, I don't have a whole lot to say about. He's a likable guy. What's unique about him is that he is in command of the first Warp 5 starship, so he is making a lot of first contact situations and kind of bumbling his way across the Alpha Quadrant. And he's a nice guy, but like there isn't, I feel, as much definitive to say about him as there is, the other captains. Like he relies very heavily on Subcommander Paul, the Vulcan officer, who knows a lot more about space and has interacted with many of these species. And I feel like that relationship is very invaluable to him. And he is a good captain. And he does know when to, show some deference to her and her knowledge and expertise. But at the same time, he also makes some serious faux pas, some gaffes with different species, because he's just simply inexperienced. And so that's kind of, I think, what Enterprise and the 22nd century Starfleet is about, is kind of just getting their feet wet in space. And it usually goes pretty well, but sometimes not so well, but like never so bad that you end up in an interstellar war or anything like that. So Archer is interesting, but he's not as cavalier or assured of himself, I would say, Kirk is not as well defined as Picard, Sisko, or Janeway. But in his defense, the Janeway, Sisko, and Picard have 200 years of Starfleet experiences and prior leadership to rely on, and Kirk has at least a century of that. So Archer really is kind of we can say he's an amateur, but at the same time, he's the first one out there. So,
right.
If any of those captains were the first, without any prior information or prior backup, would they have done so well? I'm not sure, because that's the thing, is that, yeah, he kind of bungles his way, but at the same time, he handles it relatively well considering the situation, so I'll say that for Archer. Discovery has kind of had a revolving door on captains. They have had 3 seasons and they've had a different captain for each season.
Really?
Yes. And I guess what I will say is that, so the main character, Michael Burnham, she starts out as a first officer on the Shenzhou under Captain Georgiou. And then, she ends up disobeying orders, with good reason. And that kind of leads to kind of like her downfall. And then eventually she ends up on the Discovery. And there she serves as a science officer. And it's kind of like her path, I think, to the captain's chair. She also does a lot of things her own way. And she finally does take command, like is put in charge. They say, well, we have a different way of doing things, but you have your own way of doing things, but it works. So, so we would love for you to command Discovery. And so it was at the very end of the 3rd season that they finally put her in charge. And so, and that may seem like it's unusual, but in the same sense, I would say, no, she's very much like Kirk or Janeway or Sisko, she did it her way.
Yeah. Well, and I think of various analogies with all of this. I think of military analogies from history, which never been in the military, so I don't know a whole lot about that. But also like business leadership, of course, is an easy analogy to draw to. But just for military analogies that come to mind, I was talking with some friends a while ago about how sometimes you don't really know what's going to work. So an example being Ulysses S. Grant. On paper, didn't really look like he would be very good. You wouldn't have expected him to be the one who would really pull off a Union victory in the end for the Civil War. A lot of other generals looked a lot better on paper. But for some reason, things just came together for Ulysses S. Grant, and he was fantastic at it. And then another example I would think of is MacArthur, General MacArthur, who's definitely also his own person, right? And that would get him into trouble. He was eventually fired, but so very successful also in the Pacific War, right? But he did a lot of things his own way. He would disobey orders. He wouldn't wear normal uniform, right? He wore his own cap that wasn't, if I'm remembering correctly, wasn't really part of the normal uniform. He always wanted to be in front of the camera. He had this big personality, but you leave him in place because he does an excellent job, even though he's not by the book. So a lot of this does seem kind of realistic to me, with like, if you have a Captain Kirk and you're an admiral looking at who you have out in your space fleet, and you see, well, this Captain Kirk, he's kind of a renegade, but he's doing a great job, so we'll just leave him in place.
Right. Well, and so one of the final missions is, and this film was widely panned for being not the best. It was Star Trek V, The Final Frontier. I think what they search for God, that was the where you get that famous line of what does God need with a starship.
I don't know if I've seen that. I don't think I have. That's not so. Wrath of Khan is 3, right? And then Search for Spock is 4.
No. So
no, Wrath of Khan is 2.
Yeah, is 2. Search for Spock is 3.
And then 4 is the humpback whale one.
Yep.
And okay.
This is the one between that one and then the final original series movie, which was The Undiscovered Country, which is also my personal favorite.
Right, the one with the prison camp in the snow planet.
Yes. The right. Gulag Rurapente.
Okay, I haven't seen this one then.
Yeah, it's not the best. Like there are parts of it that are just kind of, hokey and not really well thought out. But essentially part of it is there is this cult leader named Cybok who is on the planet Nimbus 3. And Nimbus 3 is located right on the neutral zone in between Federation space, the Klingon Empire, and the Romulan Star Empire. And there was a point where the three governments agreed to a peace agreement and that they would cultivate the planet together, and they called it the planet of intergalactic peace. Anyway, Nimbus 3 ends up being a huge failure, and so it ends up not being the paradise they said it was, even though the capital of Nimbus 3 is Paradise City. But when you get there, under Paradise, someone has written "Lost" in graffiti. And as you can see, like it's a miserable hunk of rock in space. Anyway, what happens is Cybok, a Vulcan leader, gets his followers to take over Paradise City. And his scheme is to get a starship to come to Nimbus 3 so he can go on his spiritual quest to find Shakari, the mythological home of God, like essentially Eden or heaven or whatever. And for a Vulcan, this is almost unheard of. He's actually an outcast in Vulcan society because they don't believe these things. This is a part of like their ancient mythos. Anyway, so Cybok kidnaps the Federation, Romulan, and Klingon delegates on Nimbus 3. And so Kirk and company get recalled to service when they were on shore leave. And they're aboard the Enterprise A, which has, been newly minted, but it has many mechanical problems that Scotty is loving to fix. Anyway, the Admiral comes on screen and Kirk says, the Enterprise is a mess. What can we do for you? And he says, well, surely there are other ships that can respond. And the Admiral says, other ships, yes, but no experienced commanders. I need Jim Kirk. And Kirk asks, have the Klingons responded yet? And he says, no, but you can bet that they will. And so that's the other thing, is that, yes, Kirk can at times be rebellious and a bit of a renegade, but especially in that time period, if there's a chance that you're going to run into the Klingons, well, who do you want in the captain's chair? Jim Kirk.
Right.
So,
yeah, that says a lot. That says a lot right there. Okay. Well, so one more definitely that I want to talk about also is Captain Jellicoe, who might seem out of place for this, and I guess in a way he is. But so this is a next generation captain who is briefly captain of the Enterprise. So to give a bit of a background, Captain Picard is called away from his duty as captain to go on a special ops mission for basically to the Cardassians, and he's going to be doing some espionage basically with Worf. And so he's not going to be a member of the crew anymore, and so they need a new captain. So they call in this guy Jellicoe, and it's a two-part episode. This is the one where Captain Picard gets captured by the Cardassians, and there's the whole thing about there are four lights and all of that, which is a discussion for another time. But while he is captured, Jellicoe is commanding the Enterprise, and he is very different in some interesting ways, and clashes a lot with Commander Riker. Now, just to give a bit of an introduction to this, I watched this episode a number of years ago when I knew that I was going to be getting a new boss. And so it was a very interesting episode to watch at the time, because that's basically what's happening to everyone on the Enterprise, right? Is they have this boss that they've been working with for years, and they know him, right? He's he's definitely asks a lot of them. And there's that distance that we were talking about, but they know him. Jellicoe comes on, and it's a bit of a rough transition. But anyway, do you want to talk a little bit about him?
Sure. Yeah. Well, and that's the really funny part, is that so Kirk is a bit younger and a bit more personable when we see him, in the original series. Picard, in the very beginning of The Next Generation, is much older. He's already a veteran Starfleet captain. He commanded the Stargazer for a number of years, and and he's already bald, so we already know, like, he's a bit older in age, and he's very stern at first, and we think that Picard is difficult, but then Captain Jellicoe comes along, and we realize that Picard is actually, pretty easy to be around. Like, he definitely has a reputation for excellence, but he's not domineering, and he definitely appreciates the expertise of his crew. He trusts them, they trust him. There is a relationship there, and even though there is, like, some distance, the professional working relationship is very good. Jellicoe, as Riker says, has everybody so wound so tight that there's no joy in anything anymore, and that he doesn't inspire people to go out of their way for him. And so the two-parter, Chain of Command, is a very interesting episode. So it was a part of a Cardassian plot to actually capture Captain Picard, and the reason he was tapped for the mission was because of his expertise in monitoring theta band waves, carrier waves. And it was the possibility that the Cardassians were developing a very serious weapon against the Federation. And so that was one reason why Admiral Nechev pulls Picard from command of the Enterprise, because of his expertise. And then also because, again, it seems like there's going to be a chance of an escalation with the Cardassians. So she wants someone on the bridge of the Enterprise, the flagship, with someone who has a lot of experience with the Cardassians, which in this case is Edward Jellicoe. And so he does have a reputation, and he is a good captain in the sense that, obviously he did what it takes, to ascend to that role, and he has been successful, but he does have a very different style. He's very hard, he's very difficult, not warm and fuzzy whatsoever, very demanding, so.
Yeah.
So,
something that's interesting is that there's one crew member who works very well under him, as Data. But
yes,
but Data kind of makes it worse for everyone else too. But Data, he doesn't care, right? He's an android. He doesn't have emotions. He doesn't have to rest. He doesn't have to amuse himself, really. I mean, he does, but so there's a scene where Jellicoe's down in engineering, and he's asking all these things to be done to prepare for their encounter. And Data says, "Oh yeah, we could do this, this, and this." And Geordi's like, "Well, yeah, if we work nonstop for 72 hours or something." And Jellicoe says, "Get it done." That's his line, right? Get it done.
Get it done. Actually, yep. What he says is that it sounds like he's like, "Well, Geordi, it sounds like you have some work to do,"
Right.
And then he says, "Get it done," But
get it done.
Yeah.
Right. And I actually I do have a transcript from one scene. So he has, he does have his redeeming qualities. I would say ultimately he is not as good as Picard, but he does have some redeeming qualities. There's a scene where Riker and Troy are in a meeting with the Cardassians. Oh, and by the way, he has Troy put on a normal uniform also. So does Troy go back to the older suit after that, or does she stay in the Star Trek suit after? I don't remember.
She stays in the standard duty uniform from then on.
From then on. Okay, so from then, even after Picard's back.
Yes, and you will see her in some of her other outfits if it's like from one scene to the next to show that she's changed outfits, but in every episode she's still in the standard duty uniform. But
Yeah.
actually it was that was intentional. They had wanted to put her in a regular uniform. They knew the reason why, and that
Right.
became the reason why.
And that was a very good way to do it. Yeah. Because he was just very much, okay, you are a crew member, you need to be in a normal uniform. So anyway, they go and they have this meeting, and Jellicoe just blows up. Like, he just loses his temper and is yelling and screaming. And then he leaves the room, and Troy and Riker follow him. And then immediately he's like out of he takes off the act, and you realize he was just faking it. And then he says, all right, let him stew for a few minutes, then go in and tell him you've convinced me to meet with them one more time. Tell him I'm a loose cannon and that he needs to be more reasonable because I'm such an unreasonable man. Lemick will want to bring his own aides on board. Pretend to be worried that I'll object, and then give him grudging permission for 2 aides, no more. Understood? I think that was a pretty funny scene, because like part of it's the act, right? Like, he knows that he is he puts on this unreasonable facade, and it probably is partly true, but he has at least that self-awareness that he knows the effect that he has on people, and it is calculated. He's doing it on purpose, and he's doing what he thinks needs to be done to get the job done. Whether he's right or not is another issue, but
sure. And it's, when it comes to things like that, like, brinkmanship is a very dangerous game, and they're very, very close to, potentially war with the Cardassians over this. And I remember that scene very well, and it is kind of funny. I also, it was one reason why I disliked him so much, because he just really hammed it up, when he was trying to appear like a loose cannon. And that is, what the Cardassians would need to respond to. But the thing is that we've seen Sisko handle the Cardassians with much better finesse. Like, he exudes the strength you need to deal with the Cardassians without being inauthentic. And and there wasn't really a need for that kind of theater. And usually I don't think Starfleet captains really do that. That's something that we haven't really seen before. That's not something Picard would have done. Sisko, Janeway, really any of them, any of the ones we know and love would do something like that.
Right.
And and that scene, like, you cut off, like, from my favorite part, like, Riker doesn't really like the guy, but as soon as Jellicoe walks away, Riker says, well, at least he's sure of himself. And then Troy says, no, he's not.
Yeah, it's a good point.
She can sense.
Right. And it doesn't really, because the Cardassians know, they know some things that he does not, which is that they knew from the beginning that this was a setup and that they have Picard, and so it doesn't end up working out too well for them. But one other thing I was thinking about Jellicoe is so there are some interactions where Jellicoe's in the captain's seat in his ready room, and Picard is there as a guest talking with him, and while he's doing his training and preparation, and there's some comm call where Riker tells him that such and such was completed, or like he asks Riker, was this thing completed? And Riker said, oh yeah, it was completed already. And it's like, why didn't you tell me? And he said, I didn't know that you wanted to be informed. And then Jellicoe, after the call is done, Jellicoe says, I don't know about this Riker guy. And Picard's trying to tell him, no, he's fantastic. And one of the things I think about there is, so with Riker, I think Riker's response is very reasonable, right? Like, well, you didn't tell us you wanted to be informed. So what am I, a mind reader? Now, if I were in his situation and Jellicoe were coming on board, I would really try to adapt and be like, if he said, why wasn't I informed? I'd be like, oh, my apologies. we'll make sure that you're informed in the future. But then I'd also be thinking like, I need to transfer out of here as quick as possible, right? So so that's not good, right? And I think Riker is correct that he's not running the ship in a sustainable way, right? Because his crew is not going to be able to keep up unless you have a crew full of datas. That's the only way it would really work.
Right. Right. Well, and I think that interaction demonstrates something else, and that is that Jellicoe is a micromanager. You know, he wants to be informed the moment that, you know, a probe is launched. Well, is that really necessary? And so that's the thing, is that Starfleet captains, you know, have a reputation for excellence, but so do all Starfleet officers. You don't get to serve on the flagship of the Federation if you're incompetent. So that's the thing, is that these are also people that know how to do their jobs. It's not like they didn't hear the orders correctly. You know, the question is like, do you really want us to bother you with minutiae? And so it's one of those things where I think most of us would agree when it comes to leadership, that leadership is something greater than just managing the details. And in this case, we see that Jellicoe is a micromanager as opposed to just trusting his officers to do their job. Now, granted, if the officers had demonstrated that they can't do the job, then that's a different story. But in this case, he's been given no reason to distrust them or to second guess their training or their expertise or any of that. And so I think that's what we're seeing here, is that especially in Starfleet and in the Federation, you know, successful relationships and cooperation is based on mutual respect and trust. Jellicoe doesn't treat his subordinates with that same level of respect and trust. And I think that that's where we run into a serious problem. And I will say that that is the vein of commonality between really all of the captains. I mean, as different as they are, Archer, Kirk, Picard, Sisko, Janeway, it's their people, and their people trust them, and they treat one another with respect. That goes both ways, not just because someone is in the captain's chair. And so I would say in general, that is what makes them successful, you know, is again, you know, not just who's giving orders, but how do you communicate those orders? You know, does that get the mission done? Does it get it accomplished? You know, and you know, is your crew a healthy crew in terms of how things are? So so yeah, I would say that that those are some defining characteristics that Jellicoe does not share with I would say many or most other Starfleet captains.
Yeah. So I think what we take away from this is that anyone in management really needs to watch Star Trek, right?
Yeah, in everything I needed to learn about life, I learned from Star Trek.
But there really is a lot of good stuff here. Like, I mean, if you think about, okay, who do I want to be? Like, which captain am I going to emulate? Or if you're thinking like, okay, which captain do I want to serve under? Which crew do I want to be on?
Mm-hmm. Right. And so, and for some of those, like, I really would have to think about it, you know, like, you know, you'd have to, you know, factor that, because they all have, you know, different strengths, you know, and different areas of interest, but ultimately, I think where it counts, you know, they their hearts and their heads are in the right place. So, you know, they do things differently, but ultimately, the ones we've seen are effective and they're successful. And really, you know, if that is the end result, then I think we can say that, you know, they did their job. You know, regardless of your style. So,
yeah, I mean, and obviously this is fiction, but a lot of it does seem realistic, in at least in terms of the human dynamics, right? Of leaders with people working in their organization. A lot of that seems very realistic. You know, just from organizations that I've seen, and what works and what doesn't work very well.
Well, and when I did my MBA program, and I was in international business, so we keep in mind, like cross-cultural communications and that sort of thing. But I took a class called Competing Through People. And while that was kind of one of, the softer, like fuzzier classes, that was probably one of the most valuable in terms of leadership, because it addresses a lot of those characteristics. Like, how do you work with people or through people to get the job done?
Right.
And a lot of, kind of like what you said, a lot of what I learned in that class, like I see effective examples of that in Star Trek from all the captains, and from others as well.
Yeah. All right. Well, good. I think we could probably wrap it up there. This is very interesting. Gave me a lot to think about.
Yeah.
Well, good.
No shortage there.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, as always, for coming on.